I think we're all in this tent that has horse welfare over the front flap, and there's all sorts of people in that tent, and some of them we feel aligned with, some maybe we're curious about why they think the way they think, but we're all looking for the same thing. So I hope our listeners are in that tent with us. If they're not, if they're at the flap looking in, maybe they might come in and listen to an episode or two. So you found Changing Rein. My co-host Karen and I are delighted that you're here. Changing Rein is a podcast that we decided to do because we're both interested in the future sustainability of horse sport in all its guises. This is a prequel, so it's going to tell you a little bit about our backgrounds, a little bit about the why of this podcast, and we're going to give you a sneak peek into the guests we have in season 1, which we've just finished recording. So I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to this episode of our podcast, Changing Rein. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Mita Osborne. Mita, would you like to introduce yourself for our listeners?
So I suppose first and foremost, I'm an equine vet. I grew up around horses. My father was a stud manager, but I never actually owned a horse or pony of my own. But I've always been involved in the business and the sport and the community that is horse racing and breeding in Ireland. So as well as my professional work as a vet, I sat on various industry boards and committees and councils, and I would find myself being asked about welfare matters, probably because I was the only vet in the room. And I really didn't have all the answers. In fact, I had very few of the answers because our training in welfare was very limited back when I qualified. So about 3 years ago, nearly 4 years ago now, I decided to go back to college and do a master's in animal welfare. I did it online at the University of Edinburgh. And people say to me, oh, why didn't you just do equine welfare? And I'm actually really glad that I did animal welfare because it exposed me to the whole variety of thinking around animal welfare across species, from zoo animals to intensive farming to companion animals and of course to horses. So I suppose I realized then that the old paradigm that I was used to of welfare really being about health care and husbandry wasn't enough. And I realized things needed to change. We really weren't talking much about the perspective of the horse. So, and then during my dissertation year, I needed a dissertation topic, and I came across a paper by a certain Karen Luke on applying systems thinking to horse welfare. And I thought, this looks interesting. So I contacted you. Luckily, I was in Melbourne the following November, and we met for coffee, and I think that went on for 3 hours, and we've had a friendship since. So when you contacted me about doing this podcast, I jumped at the opportunity.
And aren't I so lucky that you did? So what a great introduction. So thank you for joining me. We're going to have lots of fun. And just, I guess, to tell people listening a little bit about me, I'm actually Dr. Karen Luke. I did a PhD in rider safety and horse welfare recently, and studied lots of little bits and pieces, but I looked at horse welfare assessment and how that might relate to rider safety, and that was really interesting. I've also, like Mita, I've been involved in horses all my life, mostly as an amateur horse owner. I love riding. I still ride, still have young horses, and really enjoy my time with them. And when I finished my PhD, I guess it was a bit of a crossroad for me. I could have continued on and done more research. But one of the things that really struck me when I was doing my research work was just how much research there is, and how hard it is for owners and practitioners to access that research. So one of the ideas was to, and Mita has a lovely expression of being given the keys to the library when she started her master's. And I guess that's part of the motivation of doing the podcast, is to help people get access to some of that research. And also just start to ask a few questions and see where the journey of this podcast takes us. Because Mita and I are both very aligned, and we're both really keen about the future of equestrian sport. We both have grown up and lived most of our lives involved in one form or another of equestrian sport, and there are a few question marks hanging over the sport at the moment, particularly around horse welfare, and we would like to explore how we can facilitate ways that we can protect the industry and make sure it has a good future.
What's your why for this podcast?
Like, my why is my earliest memory of being on this planet is sitting on my dad's lap begging for a horse when I was about 3 years old. And I've just always loved horses. I feel like horses have given me so much in my life that I would be so sad if other people don't have that opportunity to get that enjoyment and the well-being, that we get from horses. But I think we have to focus on their well-being. Do you think we should talk about what our vision for equestrian sport is? Do you think that, as a way of introducing the podcast, like setting it up in terms of, well, this is what we see, this is what we would like the future to be?
Yeah, except remember that quote I sent you the other night from Rainer Maria Rilke about holding the question?
Yes.
Being in the question rather than striving for the answer.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. I do like that.
That's where I am. I thought initially we would find an answer. And I think the answer is going to be something like a piece of fabric, a piece of embroidery. There's different threads coming through it. Eventually a picture emerges. And I think the threads are our guests. We're kind of we're the backing material, if you like. That's how I see it, that we're in the middle of embroidering this potential solution.
A tapestry.
A tapestry. And some of the stitches will be just the grass at the bottom. I like to open up the opportunity for conversation so that other people smarter than me can come up with the solution. So
yeah, and maybe your superpower is drawing that all together and creating the space for those conversations. So that's really important.
And it's kind of back to why I didn't go on and do a PhD, because that would just be knowing more and more about less and less. And that doesn't interest me at all. I want to know as much as I can, but I know I can't go too deeply on any topic. I just know there's such a vast world of knowledge out there, and ways of being and ways of thinking. And I just want to pull them all together in some way. I have a kind of a magpie mind.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit the same, because I like to know everything about everything. So, and so I think that's very similar. I think that's cool about the sitting in the question. Yeah.
So we're bringing this introductory episode to our listeners at the end of recording our first series of episodes. And I thought it might be a good idea just to give our listeners a quick flavour of who we have on and what struck us about them, what's going to be interesting to listen out for. So our first guest was Naomi Ainley, who is, I suppose, would describe herself as an equine industry education specialist. What struck you about Naomi's interview or her time with us, Karen?
I thought Naomi was a wonderful person to interview. She was incredibly generous in her responses, and she gave a lot of insights into some of the challenges that particularly amateur horse owners face in terms of if they do have questions or things that, if they've been taught in a traditional way and are finding that they're not getting the results that they want, that it can be really hard to find alternatives, and that sometimes having that confidence to strike out on your own is hard. It's hard to muster. So that was one of the things that I really took out of chatting with Naomi. What about you?
Yeah, but what struck me was I would love to be one of her students because she seems such a supportive educator, but also innovative. So I think those students are getting a fantastic exposure to lots of different aspects of how we look after horses and what we do with them. And as I said to her in the podcast episode, I've often looked at the list of speakers she's invited to Northumberland College and thought I'll just hop on a plane to Newcastle and go and see these people, because she really stretches the boundaries for those students, and I think that's really good. Our next guest was one closer to home for me. It was Kevin Blake, who is he wears an awful lot of hats in Irish racing. I suppose I was interested because he was in the media quite a bit last year over the response to animal activists and their concerns about the Grand National, and I suppose Kevin was part of racing's response to that. And I suppose that's the whole topic of social license, which of course is going to be a feature of, I'd say, a lot of our guests. What did you think about Kevin, or what was their take home from Kevin, Karen?
There were a couple of things that in our interview with Kevin. One, I guess, was I was struck by his preparedness to sort of listen to alternative point of views. Like, he definitely had his own views, but he was quite open to sort of listening to alternative approaches. And it seemed to me like he really does want to find ways of making racing better for horses. I think he does have a genuine concern there for the welfare of racehorses, and can see that things do need to change. Like, obviously, none of us have the magic wand or all the answers, but I think it's such a fabulous start to be able to have a conversation with someone in racing where, when I'm not an activist, you're not an activist, but we do have concerns. And it was lovely having that opportunity to talk to Kevin and play around with a few ideas. I think that was what I enjoyed the most about it.
Mm-hmm. And I think it'll probably be a recurring theme, but Kevin was one of those guests where you think, oh, I'd like to have him back on in 6 months or a year and just see how things have evolved in his world and in his thinking and our thinking as well. So I think that's one of those ones where we might just bookmark another opportunity to speak to him. The third guest was Andrew McLean, who, as we said, needs no introduction to anyone involved in equestrianism. I was struck by his logical approach to understanding how horses learn. His journey was fascinating for me. And particularly the little snippet where you actually had a psychology professor in common. I thought that shows you what a small little world this world is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when that name came up, I was flabbergasted that we shared the psychology professor in common. And the thing that I really enjoyed about Andrew's interview was that he offers some really useful, practical information that any horse owner, whether you're a racing person or you're a amateur owner or you're a breeder, he just had some really common sense ideas that he shared with us that people could use in a practical sense, as well as some really interesting, more sort of theoretical type things that we talked about as well. So I think there's a little bit of something for everyone from that episode.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We often ask our guests if they had a magic wand, or if a genie appeared beside them, what was the one thing they would wish for? And I liked his answer, but our listeners will have to actually tune into that episode to see what it was. Our fourth guest is John Berry. What I liked about John is a racehorse trainer from Newmarket in England, but he's more than that. He was also mayor of Newmarket. He's town councillor. He's a huge interest in the history of racing. And I thought what was important about having someone like John on is that he's a practitioner. He's been a racehorse trainer for 27 years, something like that. So he's seen it, the ups and the downs and the ins and the outs. And he runs something that his wife described as a free range stable, which I thought was intriguing.
Yeah, I have to say the whole notion of a free range racing stable absolutely intrigues me. And I hope I get to come over to the UK next year. And if I do, I will be definitely going to visit the free range racing stable if John will have me, because it sounds amazing. And and I think one of the things I really liked about his idea was he talked about creating, approaching some of the changes to the way racehorses are kept using a really practical, sensible approach. Maybe challenging, that's not to say not challenging, but a really practical, sensible approach, I think. And again, I think our listeners will have to tune in to find out what that is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Our next guest was an example of just reaching out to someone, because neither of us knew Jake Vesey before you emailed him, Karen. And I think that's the beauty of a podcast like this. You can cast your net and see what comes back. And I think we really got something special in Jake's interview.
Absolutely. The reason I reached out to Jake was while I was doing my PhD, I came across some of his work, and Jake has sort of a few hats, but is a specialist in sort of designing habitats for rare and endangered species, as well as all sorts of things to do with conservation and the relationship between conservation and zoos. And I think what I hoped Jake would bring would be a really fresh perspective in how we care about horses. And I think he absolutely delivered that in spades. There was some parts to his interview where I remember the next day chatting to my family and describing some of the enclosures that he had built, I think for a Siberian tiger, which is a really challenging animal to keep in captivity. But yeah, I think that will be I think people will find that a really interesting episode. Was there a bit that struck you with that interview, Mita?
Yeah, it was definitely around how it's not just about the size of the enclosure, but it's about, I suppose, speaking very simply, making it an interesting enclosure for the animals. We called this episode "Movement with Purpose," so it's not just about pacing up and down in front of that glass wall. It's actually moving because in that corner there could be something that smells nice, and in the other corner through the bamboo maze there could be a water hole. I just thought it was fascinating, and I could visualize it, even though I hadn't seen pictures of it. I could visualize what it was like in my own mind.
Yeah, and as he was speaking, I was visualizing how we could incorporate that into how we care for horses as well. So I think people will find that really interesting.
Absolutely. And I suppose in the same way that we talk about having a practitioner like John Berry on, I think it's really good to have someone who's not quite in the equestrian or horse sport mainstream, someone from outside who can bring some really, really interesting ideas. Our final guest in this series was William Micklem, who's very well known for some of the innovations he's developed in terms of bridles and girths. But he's also got, I suppose, I don't think he'd mind me saying, he has the wisdom of experience. He has seen a lot, he's done a lot, he's been a breeder, he's bred horses that have gone to the Olympics, and he's taught a lot about a lot of things. And I really enjoyed listening to William. In fact, he has, and even for someone with his experience, he's still interested in trying new ideas. We called this episode "Love and Delight" because I really think that's what came across. I thought it was a great episode to end the first series on.
I absolutely agree, and I think he really captured that essence of uh, the unique place of the horse, or the unique place that horses hold for people,
Yeah,
and the love and delight that they bring us. Yeah, absolutely.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
But
So
but again,
sorry. Yeah,
oh, that's all right.
yeah,
I was going to say,
sorry.
but again, he also he offers our listeners some really practical, useful things that they can implement in their everyday interactions with horses. As much as we want to talk about the theoretical things and discuss, concepts and talk about questions, it's also really nice, I think, that some of these in some of these episodes, there's some really great practical things that people can take away and go, you know what, I'm going to give this a go today with my horse and see what happens. And I think that's a really nice part of our
Mm.
of changing Rein.
Absolutely, absolutely. It seems achievable. It's not something that's out of reach. I suppose we've chatted a lot. We've come on a journey ourselves. You and I have come on a journey, Karen, even in the last 3 months as we have been putting this podcast together. Um, can I ask you, has what we have done matched the why of what we were trying to do for you?
I think it definitely has. Yeah, it took a little while, didn't it? While we sort of took a
Mm,
little while to find
mm,
our feet and really understand what it was we were trying to achieve with the podcast. But I think what we've
mhm,
found as we've gone through the process of talking to all these different people is that, and we'd use the analogy of headroom. We feel like there's so much headroom and there's so much space for all people to make little changes and just think about things that can make horse sport better for horses, and by doing so, protecting the future of the sport that we both and love and know lots of other people love too.
mm. That's absolutely it. That sums it up for me. We want people to come on this journey with us, and we have set up our various social media channels, and we really would like people to engage and interact with us, and most definitely suggest topics that they'd like to hear us cover, guests they'd like to listen to, because we're all heading in the same direction. We often use on the podcast, we use an analogy of a tent. I think we're all in this tent has that has horse welfare over the front flap, and there's all sorts of people in that tent, and some of them we feel aligned with, some maybe we're curious about why they think the way they think, but we're all looking for the same thing. So I hope our listeners are in that tent with us. If they're not, if they're at the flap looking in, maybe they might come in and listen to an episode or two. One of these episodes actually includes I don't know what you call it. It's like photo bombing, but it's video pod bombing. So there's a video pod bomber in one of these episodes. So look out for that. Let us know if you've found that person. But we'd love to hear from you, and we hope you enjoyed this first series of Changing Rain. Is that okay?
I think that's fantastic. Yeah. Hey, it's Karen. Thanks for making it this far in our prequel episode. We really appreciate you listening. You can support the show by liking and subscribing. And of course, it'd be great if you could tell your friends about the show, and writing a review would be fantastic. If you have any questions or they have an idea for the show or someone you'd like us to interview, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is team@changingrain.com.au. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.